Ну что, дорогие друзья, здравствуйте, добро пожаловать. Я уже сбиваюсь со счета. Наверняка уже на четвертый день фестиваля Different Ever After. Фестиваль, организованный посольством Великобритании в Москве и ведущим российским просветительским медиа теории и практики. 2020 год повлиял на жизни многих людей и общества в целом. Я думаю, ни для кого не секрет, что многое важное и интересное происходит сейчас, что меняет не только наших людей, знакомых, но также и мир в целом. Фестиваль покажет другую Великобританию, которая сильно отличается от стандартных стереотипов, современную, инновационную, открытую для всех страну. Дорогие друзья, позвольте рассказать вам про технические моменты. Во-первых, на протяжении нашей следующей сессии будет вести сурдоперевод, а также, чтобы вы знали, вся следующая сессия, разумеется, будет проведена на английском языке. Если вы чувствуете себя некомфортно и хотите воспользоваться функцией перевода, то, пожалуйста, найдите вот здесь, вот в этой части кнопку «Перевод». Если у вас Zoom на английском, то она звучит как «Interpretation». Нажмите и поставьте русский язык. И таким образом вы включите функцию автоперевода. Ну что, дорогие друзья, мы готовы начинать. We're pleased to welcome you within the hospitable online grounds of the festival Different Ever After, which is aimed to bring up the best English practices in many fields that constantly lead to important changes within our society. We have no time to spare, so let's get started. Дорогие друзья, ну что, мы начинаем. Правда или художественный вымысел? В своих произведениях писатели часто опираются на исторические факты и придают персонажам черты реальных людей. Дискуссии, посвященные непростым отношениям между подлинным и вымышленным, в литературном творчестве примут участие писатели Джей Бернард, Надифа Мохамед и Руперт Томсон. Встречу проведет профессор Джон Маллэн. На примере своих произведений участники будут говорить о том, какую роль в их творчестве играют подлинные истории людей. Давайте же об этом поговорим. Прошу, я передаю слово модератору дискуссии Джону Маллэну. John Malлэн, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And apologies to our Russian friends for the slightly late start. You might not be aware, this is the day in Great Britain when the clocks change, plunging all academics like myself into a state of bottomless confusion. So, but we are here now, and we're going to be talking for the next hour or an hour and a half about some of the ways in which today's most interesting and ambitious writers might be making use of real events, real historical people, true lives in their fictional or creative writing. And I've got three really different writers with me to do that, but three writers who all in some ways make use of real events in their work. My name's John Mallän. I am an academic, as I said. I'm Professor of English Literature at University College London. I'm really interested in contemporary writing, but also I'm quite interested in Russia as well. And one of the reasons I'm doing this is because for the first time about 4 years ago, I did a British Council event on contemporary British fiction in Moscow, which I very much enjoyed. And then just over 2 years ago, I came to Russia again with the British Council, with some British writers, novelists mainly, and we went to Yasnaya Polyana for a conference. And that, I think, was one of the most memorable literary events that I've ever been to, actually. So when I was asked to do this online, I jumped at it. And my only sadness is that it does have to be virtual rather than real. But anyway, I hope I'll be able to do it again in person one day. Let me briefly introduce you to the writers. What we're going to do in a second is we're going to allow each of them in turn to read briefly, each from one of their books. And I'm going to ask some questions of each of our writers in turn, and then we're going to go to a more general conversational discussion. And of course, at the end, towards the end, we will be having your questions. So first of all, I'm going to go in alphabetical order of surnames. So first of all, we have Jay Bernard, who is a writer, a poet, from London. I think the fact that they are from London is probably quite important to the poetry too, but we might get a chance to discuss that. And Jay burst upon the scene recently with their collection Surge, which has made such an impression that it has become a set book for undergraduate students studying English literature at my university. It took Wordsworth a century to get on the reading list, but it's taken Jay only about a year. And this is their first Surge, is their first full-length collection, and was awarded the Ted Hughes Award for New Work in Poetry. And Jay will be reading from some of that quite shortly. Second, in alphabetical order, is Nadifa Mохамед, who also, everybody bursts on the scene, don't they? And Nadifa burst too, but she burst 10 years ago with her first novel, Black Mamba Boy, which we're going to hear a bit about in a minute. But I hope we'll also be able to talk to her a bit about what she's written since then. I remember, I will confess, this is the book on that we're going to be talking about that I've actually read twice, because I read it when it first came out 10 years ago. It was shortlisted for the Guardian First Book Award. I think that's why I'm a terrible one, I'm afraid, for looking at prize lists and obediently reading the books on them. And thirdly, we have Ruperт Tomson, who was actually one of the writers. He must be a complete Russophile, for he was one of the writers who was with us a couple of years ago at that event at Yasnaya Polyana. And he's best known as a novelist. He is the most practiced hand on our panel today, because I think, I'm sure Rupert will correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the novel that we're going to talk about or focus on mostly today, the novel of his, Never Anyone But You, is his 11th novel. I think right. It's the 11th, yes, I've got that right. But he's also a memoirist, and we discussed those 2 years ago, his memoir with, I think, the top memoir title that I know of, This Party's Got to Stop. A sentence as a parent on my lips on an almost monthly basis. But anyway, so those are our writers. And I think you may, members of our audience may or may not have sort of sampled their work, but I think it's really, it would be really great if we get a flavor, a taste, a relish of it by hearing them read. So what I'd suggested was that Nadifa was going to go first and has a reading for us. And I don't know if you want to say anything about the reading before you start, Nadifa, or if you just want to go straight into it. It's from Black Mamba Boy, yes.
Yes, I've just unmuted myself. I'm sorry if there's any background noise. I live on a busy road, so there's lots of ambulances and cars going past noisily. So yes, I'm reading from my first novel, Black Mamba Boy, which is a fictionalized biography of my father, specifically his very early life from the age of around 9 till 22. So it grew out of these conversations I had with him just after university. And actually the first one was while I was still at university. And I think I was just trying to fix myself in history. I studied history and politics and really didn't know enough or anything about my family history. And my father unrolled this crazy, dramatic, historically important story, and I just couldn't stop writing about it. So this scene is one of the more sad scenes in the novel, and it's based on my father's real experience. Jabril entered the tent, his dark face ashy and drawn. He stared at Jarmat for a moment. "There is someone here to see you, Jarmat," he said. Jama trotted by Jibril's side, kicking pebbles out of the way and waving to his friends, his face burning with white-hot joy. Jibril was stiff and silent beside him. Jama tidied himself up, spat onto his dry white elbows and knees and fluffed up his hair with his fingers. Jibril's eyes were wide and shiny. Jama saw the reflection of a flock of crows taking flight in them. A man spilt a basket of lentils as Jama passed and crouched down to scoop them up, while a group of Somali askaris stood nearby, smoking. "Wait here, he's coming," mumbled Jibril, before joining the other askaris. The minutes ticked by as long as days. The sun's heat felt like a heavy weight on his head. Jama prayed for his father to hurry up, the Arabic words muddling in his mind as mosquitoes buzzed beside his ears. A man came over the horizon. A small cardboard suitcase hung from his fingers. Jama took tiny steps forward. As the man approached, Jama's heart sank as he looked up and saw a middle-aged, grey-bearded man staring down at him. His skin was a creamy light brown, and he wore a red fez perched on the side of his head. His stomach hung a few inches away from Jama's face. This was not the man he had imagined. "Assalamu alaikum, Jama. Forgive me, but I come with unfortunate news. Gure's life has ended. He was on the road from Gadaref when he ran into a military roadblock. They opened fire and killed everyone. We buried him yesterday in Gadaref. We all live on borrowed time, and by the decree of Allah Karim, Gure's time on earth has passed. It was not his fate to see you. Here are his belongings. May Allah have mercy on you." The man's words swam around Jama without meaning. They sounded like the crashing of waves or the gurgle of blood to him, their substance broken up and diluted. He crouched down on the dirt, covered his ears. He needed to vomit. He couldn't breathe. Grief had stolen the air from his lungs, drained the blood from his veins. He clawed at the earth to bury himself. Jibril pulled at Jama's arm, but he refused to rise, to open his eyes, and Jibril withdrew to stand by the wall and wait. At last, Jama inhaled a deep breath and took hold of his father's flimsy suitcase. The touch of the handle, its shape molded to his grip, its color stained with his sweat, set Jama's hand aflame. He stared into the stranger's eyes, and the man nodded and walked away, back over the horizon. Jama crouched down, bent over the suitcase, his body taking the shape of the boulders placed above nomads' graves. He untied the string holding the case shut and delicately opened it. He hoped to find his father's head inside, just so that he would finally know what he had looked like. He wanted to press his hand against his father's stubble, to trace the face that contained the only likeness of his own. Instead, he found a threadbare mauve ma'awis, a few notes and coins, an amber tusbah, a worn-down toothstick, a stringed musical instrument, and a rusted toy car. Jama pressed his face against the grit of the Eritrean waste ground, his journey at a bitter end. The moon hid in shame and left Hajar in morning black. One by one, the planets Jama's life orbited around had spun away and left him in a universe where he was just debris floating in starless obscurity. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nadifah. I mean, you explained to our listeners and watchers what the novel was sort of about. I suppose this passage, one of the extraordinary things about it, which might not be, well, won't be clear to those who are listening to us, is Jama, who is based on your father. He's only something like 12 years old, I think? Or,
yes.
Yes,
yeah.
when this is happening. So, yes. So the first things I just wanted to ask you, actually, because the first thing you see when you open, after the epigraphs, when you open Nadifa's book, is a map, actually. A map of part of East Africa. And Jama, at this very young age, goes on an extraordinary sort of journey. His mother dies in Aden, where he's living a hand-to-mouth existence, and he goes across, he travels through Somaliland, well, so he's kind of quite uncertain borders between a lot of these countries,
Yeah,
Eritrea, Sudan, Abyssinia, to try and find his father. And the bit that you've just read is he finds his father is dead.
Yes.
I mean, if I didn't know that this was absolutely based on truth, and I suppose that's what we're talking about, works based on truth, I think I would think, I don't believe a 12-year-old could do that.
I agree, and that's something that's a recurring theme of reading to audiences around the world, is that it's about 90% based on his real life and 10% from my imagination, and people can never work out which is which. And the things that sound really unbelievable are the things that really happened to my father. And the things that I've added, such as his marriage to Bethlehem, no one picks up on that as a fictional aspect of the story.
Right. And I mean, I think that because this moment in the story that you've read from is the moment when, as it were, his hopes are dashed, and the thing that he's been striving for, to find his father, is taken away from him. But we're still less than halfway through the novel, and he's got to
Yes.
survive and travel onwards. And you know, I mean, it's incredible the kind of the sort of force that must have driven him to do that at such an early age.
Yes, and an important aspect of actually his life in comparison to the novel is that his mother was still alive.
Right.
So that the thing that propelled him forward, especially beyond this point where really he didn't have any purpose in life, was his mother. And later on, when he decides, he doesn't really decide, his mother tells him to go and join the British Merchant Navy. And my grandmother gave him her life savings and said, okay, Egypt is somewhere in that direction, go. But that relationship and the way that she formed him and allowed him to feel some sort of integrity as a person, as a human being with value in a world that really gave him no value, that was an integral part of him thinking, okay, I'm not bound by the situation I'm in, I can keep going.
Can I just, we must go on to Jay's reading in just a second. I just wanted to ask you, because I don't know the answer to this at all. So how old were you when your father told you the story of his life, or did he tell it in lots of sort of bits, or?
So my father was very old when I was born, in my eyes, and he would drop these things into conversation. That time I was in Eritrea and I was locked up with a tortoise. Or the last headache I had was in Ecuador in 1979, things like that. So you can't place them. What can you do with that information? And I don't think I cared, to be honest. And it was later, when I was about 20, 21, that I started to have some curiosity about it and heard everything in this consecutive. We had these 3 days of recording and interviewing. And that's when everything fell into place.
Right. Okay. Well, maybe we'll be able to come back to some of the details of that story when we have our general discussion. But now, Jay, you're happy to be next up. And Jay Bernaرد's going to read from some poems in Surge. I don't know, Jay, if you want to say anything to introduce them.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, I'm Jay, and I wrote Surge, and I guess I'll give factual things first, because there's actually quite a lot of history behind the book. Essentially, in London in 1981, there was a huge house fire that took place in South London, which is where I live, in Lewisham, and 13 Black children died. And the reason it's important to say that is because it was a very specific time. There were a lot of fire bombings. There was a lot of fascism. A lot of houses were being burned down, businesses and so on. So 13 children died, including 16-year-old Yvonne Ruddock, whose birthday it was. And there's been no conclusion ever since, really, about whether it was a racist attack, whether it was something that started within the house. So it's a kind of really key bit of history that sort of remains inconclusive, but nonetheless had quite a massive impact on British politics kind of thereafter. But what drew me to the story was the fact that despite it having such a huge impact, there was a big march that happened afterwards. There was a lot of like activism around it. So much, like the inquest was filmed and so on. Despite that, I'd never heard of it as a kid. It had never been talked about. It had never been taught. And so I wanted to kind of like write these poems in order to at least put this history on the shelf where somebody could take it down. So I'm going to read just two poems from the book. Plus. The officer said, "Oh, it's very common for culprits to go missing." I said, "My son isn't a culprit, and how dare he imply it?" And one of the officers stood by the window and looked out. He didn't want to look us full in the eye. He made it clear from the moment he set foot in the house, the moment he set foot, what he thought of us. And when they came back a few days later, I think it was the Tuesday, they said, what were you wearing on the night of the fire? I said, probably your new trousers. And he said, was you wearing a yellow shirt? I said, yes. Brown shoes? I said, yes. And he took out the items from a plastic bag. He took your things from a plastic bag. And he says, does this look like it? Does this look like it belongs to you? I says, yes. And he said, do you recognize this key? I said, why don't we try it? And we struggled and it fit. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. So I said, what are you sorry for? I want to see my son. Stammer. They say they don't think it's a good idea. I said, I am your father. I said, I am your father. I want to see you. They led us down to a room, and on the table, there he was, no face, nothing to speak of. I said, this is the body where you found the clothes. Nod. So I said, it must be you. This must be my son. You came, Dad. I'd been lying there all night and I couldn't move. I opened my eyes, I was in the house and everything was black, Dad. I'd been at the party a few hours and I didn't know about anything that had happened, Dad. And I felt someone touch me, but I was stiff, Dad. I've never been so stiff before. I tried to say, it's me. But they were looking at me so strangely, Dad. Like he couldn't stand to look at me, couldn't stand the sight of me. Police always looked at me like that. And he turned me over and he took the shirt from under me and they wrapped me in a blanket and drove me here. And I was lying there waiting for you, Dad. Across the table, there were bodies, Dad, twisted, Dad. No heads, like screaming branches of a tree, Dad. Loads of them, I swear. And I heard them say, they were saying, and then you came. And I was calling out to you, Dad. And I know you heard me because here we are, Dad. Come back and don't bury me. I can't stand it. I can barely stand it when the lights go off and I'm here and spend the whole night listening for you, Dad. I want to crawl between Mum and you, in your bed, in your sheets, Dad. That's the only kind of burying I want. Hiss. Going in when the firefighters left was like standing on a black beach with the sea suspended in the walls, soot suds like a conglomerate of flies. You kick the weeds and try to piece it back. Fractured shell, a bone, bloated antennae, flesh, thigh, spindle, gangrenous pet fish, an eye or a tiny glaring stone, a seal's tongue, or the sour sinew yoking front and hind fin, vertebrae or fetters, bedsheet or slave skin. The black is coming in from the cold, rolling up the beach walls looking for light. It will enter you if you stand there and spend the rest of its time inside you asking what it was, in a vivid hiss heard only by your bones. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I wonder, Jay, if I could ask you a couple of questions actually, which kind of come directly from these poems, for me anyway. the first one that there is as it were a pair of kind of testimonies, one from a parent whose child has been killed, and the other from a dead child. And obviously the second of those is the kind of thing a poet can do, imagining a dead person speaking. The first of them is almost like a transcript of a person talking about remembering a real thing. I mean, what relation does that first piece play to testimonies and transcripts that you actually came on when you were making this collection?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It is from a transcript. So one of the things I spent a lot of time reading were the statements taken from the parents about how they'd been treated by the police. The police had taken not witness statements, but statements about what happened. But those were, very leading. They were very the police obviously had a bit of an agenda. So another group of activists, they did their own individual investigation, and they took statements. So the first bit is a combination actually of two parents who said almost exactly the same thing, except the father then went on, and there was this kind of additional bit in the transcript where he then describes going on to see the boy's body. And I took the form of the poems from that as well. So the poems are blocks. They're sort of almost prose poems with lots of dashes, because the way that the statements were written were almost verbatim, actually. And then I sort of flipped that and made a transcript of the boy's testimony too.
Right. And so it's a kind of, I mean, when you did that, were you selected, did you cut bits out? Because you've preserved in the first of them some of the odd sorts of little repetitions and the kind of things that happen when you look at a transcript of somebody talking.
Yeah, I tried to keep some of that. Obviously, I changed it for dramatic effect,
yes,
at times, but I tried to keep some of the sort of strange repetitions. But the repetitions really was between the two, you see. So it wasn't that within each one people were going, oh, I thought. It was much more that when you looked at the two together, they almost were saying the same thing, like these sort of funny little repetitions between them, and then the fathers continued, you know.
And one of it, I want to go on to this to the poem Hiss as well, but one of the things which is I think very powerful about, well, the pair of them together, but it comes from the first one, is how the sort of embarrassment of the police sort of gets into so it's as if the father notices that, in his grief, he's noticing the sort of awkwardness of the policeman who's dealing with it.
Yeah, and that was a really big theme in so many of the things I was reading. The way that the police sort of had a sort of politeness that sort of trumped the emotional, heaviness of the situation, which you can sort of imagine in a professional, if it's your profession to go and give bad news, which is sort of their function, then you can see how there'd be a real detachment versus the absolute shock and horror of a parent who's kind of being told that they shouldn't fully experience that horror, as though you can have a dead child in a morgue somewhere and not want to go there. There's kind of a strangeness there.
And the other poem, Hiss, that imagines going into the burnt out flat. Yes, I mean, is that there are presumably photographs and things of the fire scene that you looked at? Is that right? And also just again trying to imagine what it was like to go up into a burned building. There are videos of
of the house after it had been burned out, and you can see that the walls are sort of almost like skin. You know, it's got that kind of, that sort of bubbled, rippled kind of effect. But then what you also see is the way it's wet, which is sort of strange. It's sort of, you know, firefighters use water, but they also use powder. There's a combination of different ways you can fight a fire. And there's a kind of, there's a sodden sort of vibe going on as well. And that sort of made me think about how the sea ships, you know, the Atlantic is such a huge part of this history as well. So I kind of decided to put it into the walls of the...
Right. Okay. Well, we must go on to our third reader, but I want to come back to kind of what you found out whilst you were sort of writing this collection or thinking about it. I don't know which is the right way to put it, in a minute. But we'll go on to our third reading, which is from Ruperт Tomson, from his recent novel, Never Anyone But You, and which, like Black Mamba Boy, covers quite an expanse of time. Would you like to tell our listeners, our viewers, what about the novel before you read from it, Ruperт?
Yeah, sure. I can talk about it a bit. I mean, basically, as you said, it's based on a true story, and it's based on the true story of these two extraordinary French women, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. And they were born with different names. They were born as Lucy Schwab and Suzanne Malherbe, and they were born in the 1890s in Western France, in a very kind of provincial, well, in the provincial city of Nantes. And they grew up there together, but they became lovers in their teens. They then became sisters. It sounds a little odd, I know. And it just so happened that the father of one married the mother of the other. And it was almost as if the parents were conspiring on their behalf to cover what the relationship. Because of course, to be women in love in provincial France in the early 1900s was unthinkable. I mean, it was just about possible in Paris, but certainly in the provinces, it was something that wasn't done. And so they were, so as I say, they were lovers, they were sisters, they were artists, they were political activists, they were iconoclasts, really. They were women who were so far ahead of their time in their work, which was mainly photography, photographs which pushed the boundaries of what a woman could be. 50 years before philosophers like Judith Butler were talking about it. Their photographs were really showing that gender is something that is performative. Gender is performed, not given to you. And Claude Cahun particularly was insistent on that. She wanted to create her own gender, which was unique and unlike anybody else's. So this is happening, as you can tell, you know, it's happening almost 100 years ago. So if they were marginal then, it's no wonder perhaps, because they were so far ahead of their time. So I'm just going to read a couple of pages from the beginning. This is my version of how they met. And Suzanne is the narrator. Our first meeting of any consequence was in the spring of 1909 in Nantes. She was still called Lucy then. She was 14 and a half. Her father, Maurice Schwab, was Jewish, and he owned and edited the biggest newspaper in Western France. Her mother was a Catholic. Madame Schwab was often ill and spent most of her life in clinics. On the morning my mother took me to their apartment, a reason was given for Madame Schwab's absence, but it sounded unconvincing, even to me, only drawing attention to the shame it was intended to conceal. A maid showed us into a parlor cluttered with the ornate, ungainly furniture so favored by bourgeois society at the time. It was still raining. It had rained all night, and the corners of the room lay in deep shadow. The space in which we stood felt rounded and bleary, like a crystal ball that was no longer being used. Lucy had been attending a school in England, my mother told me, but she was back now, and perhaps I could be a friend to her. Outside, Trees gleamed black beneath a somber sky. The door opened and Lucy stepped into the room, followed by her father. Shorter than me and slighter, Lucy seemed removed and ethereal, as if she existed in a different dimension from the rest of us. And yet I felt a jolt as our eyes met, the strong but subtle click of recognition. Words came with it, words that whispered inside my head. Ah, yes, of course. Lucy and I had played together as young children, but I had only the sketchiest memory of that. Some moments are so dazzling that they obliterate everything that came before. This new Lucy had a pale, almost luminous complexion and wavy dark brown hair, and on her cheek, halfway between her provocative, determined mouth and the delicate curl of her left ear, was a smear of red that looked like jam. I imagined I could taste that jam, and her cheek beneath it, the raspberries picked during the summer and simmered in sugar, her skin creamy and cool. I couldn't remember having such thoughts before, even about boys, and I found myself blushing, but the light in the room was so dim that I don't think anyone noticed. Lucy came forwards and spoke to me in English. How do you do, Suzanne? We shook hands. Her father sighed, then turned to my mother. I'm afraid Lucy has become something of an Anglophile. Father, Lucy said, I always was. She let go of my hand, but her eyes, which sloped downwards at the outer edges, remained fixed on mine. What did she see in me? I'm not sure. I was quiet, a little shy. My hair fell past my shoulders and was parted in the middle. I had ink stains on my fingers. There were more than 2 years between us. I was nearly 17, but I was aware of no difference in age. If anything, I felt younger. She had a kind of authority even then, the extended hand, the steady gaze. I'd never met anyone like her. Henri Michaud, who later became a friend of ours, put it best. In his collection of prose poems, Un certain plume, the head waiter places a lamb cutlet in front of the protagonist and bending close to him speaks in a voice that is mysterious and deep. That which you have on your plate, he says, does not appear on the menu. The room darkened. Over by the window, my mother was talking to Monsieur Schwab. Beyond them, in the square, the fierce, gravelly crashing of the rain. I was still staring at Lucy. I couldn't take my eyes off her. My mouth was dry and my heart was jumping. Later, Lucy would claim that she had felt the same. She said it was the first great moment of our lives. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Rupert. You talked before you read a bit about the people, the real people behind this and the story of their relationship. I wanted to ask you just a couple of questions about how you tell the story. You said you slipped in just before you began reading the bare and important bit of information that Suzanne, aka Marcel, is the narrator. But I guess that must have been quite an important decision when you decided how to write this story. Presumably, correct me if I'm wrong, but presumably after you decided that it intrigued or interested you, that it was going to be she who narrated it.
Yes, it was a decision that had to be made, really up front, actually, because there were 3 ways of telling this. There were 3 obvious ways of telling the story. One was from Claude Cahun's point of view, one was from Marcel Moore's point of view, and there was a third kind of omniscient narrator which would be too close to biography. And there was also perhaps a 4th way of doing it, where I was involved myself in a kind of postmodern way, where I would include my own research and my own adventures. And there were many adventures in the researching of this book. And I was really actually tempted at certain points to do that. But I stepped back from it because in the end, I realized that there was so much material I was dealing with, everything from surrealism to Paris in the 20s to the Second World War. I needed something to filter the material through. And what I was using was really the idea of the love story. It was the less interesting of the two people, the less interesting of the two women, who was going to be telling the story in a very kind of Great Gatsby kind of way. You know, in the Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway, who's a fairly ordinary kind of guy, is looking at the Great Gatsby, who's extraordinary. And I kind of conceived the book a little bit like that. And so I thought of Marcel more as the ordinary one at the beginning. And that's why, in a sense, the book has a fairly conventional linear structure. I mean, it's still kind of imagist in its structure, in the sense that there are huge jumps in time between the scenes, but it's still linear. And it's, in a sense, a book that Claude Cahun would have disapproved of, because it's Marcel's version of the love story. Claude Cahun was much more experimental and much more symbolist, and much more in the tradition of people like Baudelaire and her uncle Marcel Schwab. So if Claude had written the book, it would have been elusive and playful and quite frustrating to read, you know, because she could be very impenetrable. So yeah, it was a decision that was made up front, and it had its own inbuilt problems, because it had to find a voice for a woman who really, there wasn't much material about her.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious follow-up question, I guess, especially given recent arguments that have sort of taken place quite a lot in America and in Britain, I don't know if they have in Russia, about, as it were, whose stories get told by whom, who has the right, as it were, to tell whose stories, and whether novelists in particular, you know, can imagine anybody's stories if they want to. And the obvious question, given those sorts of, the currency of those sorts of arguments, is that, I mean, were you at all daunted by the fact there's quite a leap of sympathy to have to get inside the head, not just of a woman, lots of male novelists have done that, but for the first stretch of the novel, a teenage girl and a teenage lesbian woman. And that's quite a reach for Ruperт Tomson to do, isn't it? But you didn't hesitate about that.
I obviously thought about it. By the way, I should say that lesbian is a word that they never ever used. Claude Cahun refused to be pigeonholed by terms like that. She hated being categorized. She said once, "Ne rien fixé," which means, you know, I don't want to be pinned down in any kind of way. The word she used, funnily enough, was the Platonic word. I mean, a word that comes from Plato, Uranian. She described herself as a Uranian, which is the word Plato used for the very ordinary love of one man for another. So, you know, she immediately was refuting gender in the way that she categorized herself sexually. As to your question, I mean, I've sort of got two answers to it. The first is that I have never believed that imagination has a gender. I don't think imaginations are male or female. I think that I have a lot more in common with many women than I do with many men. You know, I feel more comfortable there than I do there. And so I think, you know, I don't believe that I should feel imprisoned by my biology, I suppose. And it's almost as if the skin is actually less of a barrier than we think it is. And so there's a sense in which I see the novelist as someone who kind of transitions between the genders and moves up and down that spectrum. And I don't see it as binary. I don't see it as black and white in that sense, male and female. It's a much more negotiated thing. Which leads to the second part of the answer, really. I mean, I sort of fall back on Claude Cahun's way of talking about it, which is something I quote in the book. It's something she said, which is masculine, feminine, it depends on the circumstances. Neuter, that's where I feel most comfortable. And what's extraordinary about that is that, I mean, we think of neuter as a kind of weak word or an indeterminate word. She's saying, no, neuter is strong. Neuter is like the place from which you pick what you want to be. You choose from male, you choose from female, you use the bits that you want and you build yourself. and you make yourself into something. So in that sense, you know, that idea of neuter made so much sense to me when I came across it in the research for this book. I felt as if I was being validated by her own words.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, it's good you've mentioned, I think for the second time, the word with which I sort of wanted to start in throwing the conversation open to all three of you, which is research, I guess. And because of the real people and real events behind all your stories, all your books, all three of your books, research has a sort of special quality. Lots of novelists do research, but it's perhaps often of a rather dusty kind. I just wonder if maybe I could start with you, Nadifha. You obviously have your father telling you stuff, very, very helpful for a novelist, just come into the room and, but I mean, did you do research as well? Because I didn't actually find myself wondering that as I read, but I did find myself thinking to ask, you know, to give a really, forgive this really banal response. But for instance, when the reader is in certain places in this novel, Aden, for instance, at the beginning, and you can not just see it, but sort of smell it. And I think, I wonder if she went there, you know, because this place is really palpable. Did you have to go to places, or did you read about them, or what? You're on mute, I think, Nadifha.
I did it to quieten the road noise. Yes, I did. I did go to some of the countries. I couldn't afford to go to all of them because there are so many places to go to. I didn't go to Aden. That was all photographic research, book research. My father, yes, and also my fantasy of it. Looking back now, I can see how I was sort of in love with the place, and it was a massive port. It was, I think, for one time, it was the biggest port in the world, busiest port in the world. But there was also this kind of very antique, you know, Aladdin type atmosphere there as well. And there were all of these fantastic postcards that you can buy online of that time, of studio shots of Somalis and other people. And there was another resource that proved really useful, and it was a book by a British colonial official in Aden. And he just, I don't know why, he was a nerd. He recorded every community's habits, where they worked, how much they earned, what they ate, how they got married, their religious customs. So he did this for the Somalis, the Arabs, the Jewish community, the British, everyone. So that was incredible. And it was in such minute detail that it was a real treasure for the novel. But then I did go to Somalia, Somaliland. I did go to Eritrea, Djibouti, Ethiopia, and that did massively help. And I think it was such a massive undertaking, all of these different places, this historical time that I don't know anything about, I didn't know anything about at the time, that I had to do, I felt I could only write if I did a huge amount of research. I couldn't give myself permission to write without that.
And you presumably must have done some actual reading of history books, especially for the stuff about the role of the Italians in East Africa. I mean, you know, because perhaps generationally, I have a nerdish knowledge of the Second World War, I guess, very centered on Britain, but still quite extensive.
Yeah.
But this was mostly, even given that, this was mostly new to me, what actually went on.
For sure. And, you know, all of the different connections. So the war in Abyssinia was a huge historical political moment. And people such as Sylvia Pankhurst was heavily invested in what the Italians were doing in their colonies in East Africa. She recorded many of the atrocities that they committed there. There was a massive campaign in America by African Americans to raise funds for the support of the resistance to the Italians. It was one of the main precursors. The invasion of Ethiopia was one of the main precursors and warnings of what would happen in the Second World War. So I didn't know any of this. I studied history, and of course we didn't approach any of this. So it was really important for me to learn about it. And yeah, I love history books. It's not a chore to read them. Even I remember reading one, it's called 1941 by a military historian called, I think, A.J. Barker. And it's not written for someone like me in mind, but again, it's just massively informative. And I could contrast that with what my father was saying of his experience as a 15-year-old askari in this battle in Keren, and this military historian's other perspective on that.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that about the history book. I think it was Hilary Mantel saying recently that she really liked incredibly dry history books, because it's as if the historian was saying, okay, here's the stuff, now do something with it.
Yeah.
Now
data.
Do something.
Here's data. Take it and go.
So Jay, can I ask you about research too? Because you spoke at the beginning to all of us about kind of discovering about the New Crossfire. I mean, it was really interesting for me to hear that because of my age. It absolutely, you know, it was, and I was living in London at the time, and I confess probably I haven't thought about it and again in recent years till I read your collection. But in the early 80s, it was in all our minds and in all our consciousness. But you were discovering about it. I mean, and how? I mean, what did you do in order to kind of discover about it? What did you look at? What did you read?
Well, I think I'll start with just by saying I think that's a really interesting point that you make, because there's something about the transmission of history in there that is kind of what spurred me to take on this story in some ways, because it's almost like everyone was really into it and then kind of forgot that the next generation might want to know about it, or that it could be in some ways important to have that kind of like transmission, you know, which we don't have for things like the Second World War, actually. For some reason, well, we know why, but that is sort of continually talked about and continually refreshed. But as Nadifah just said, there's all kinds of bits of history that sort of everybody kind of, almost like a kind of open secret. So when I went into the archives of the George Padmore Institute, I really went in not as a, you know, I'm not a trained.
Could you tell our Russian audience what the George Padmore Institute is?
Of course. So the George Padmore Institute is an archive in North London. It was set up by kind of writer, political activist, and bookshop owner, John Rose, and, you know, is basically a repository for a lot of sort of community sort of ephemera, documents, and so on. It's a very small archive. It's not like a really huge one. It's actually very accessible, you know, very kind of a simple sort of place to kind of like begin, actually. So when I went in...
Oh, we've lost you, Jay.
Oh.
No, just where you said where you went in, and now we've got you again.
Okay. So when I went in, I didn't go in with an agenda. I sort of went in and just looked through everything. So I just almost kind of closed my eyes and went eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and took out some boxes and just started. But when I did come across the fire...
Did you have no idea you were going to write poems about this when you went in there?
No idea.
Okay.
How interesting. Yeah, you were just following the trail of your own curiosity about...
Yeah, and I just sort of I guess my research began elsewhere. You know, I actually was much more even though I didn't have an agenda, I was much more interested in maybe carnival or you know, just other areas, but then once I hit on this, I knew that I wanted to write about it, and I looked around for other books that dealt with it. There's very, very few actually out there that have it as a kind of main topic, or, you know, so that's kind of what spurred me to do it.
Yeah, I mean, and actually in a sort of in a way that, to use Rupert's word, probably critics would call postmodern or something. The actual business of doing research is in the poems a bit, isn't it? I mean, the second poem in the collection, Arc, is in the way about opening up boxes of stuff but these aren't just, this isn't just sort of evidence of kind of the kind of thing I look at in my job, of kind of how Tennyson changed his mind about what a poem should be, but they're sort of testimonies to people's deaths.
Yeah, and I mean, Arc is a poem about putting things in boxes, really.
Yeah.
And for a while, about 2 years, I actually did work as a cataloger. I'd spent, hours and hours and hours each week cataloguing things and sort of cleaning the dust off them and putting a paperclip on. And that's literally what I'm talking about. And what was happening was that I was both working on these poems and also cataloguing and thinking about how I made things accessible to people in the future. Which is why the poem ends with, like how, where to put the burning house. It'd be like, where do you put this extremely, this searing bit of history that might not have the sort of political clout or the kind of longevity of certain other moments of history that then go on to define the narrative.
Yeah, you Rupert, you were talking about research. You said you did lots of research. You said it for your novel. You said it slightly in the tone of somebody who really enjoyed doing it.
No, well, I've got not really. I've got a kind of attitude to research, which is that the research has to take second place to the writing in some sense. So what I kind of do is I kind of wrote this book, for instance. I wrote 2 versions of it, really not knowing that much about Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. I was inspired by this photograph, which I saw in 2006. Here's a photo of, this is a photo of Claude Cahun taken in, I think, 1928. And when I saw that picture, I just sort of became intrigued by who this person was. I didn't know at that point whether it was a man or a woman. And then I started to look into it a little bit. But before I had too much information, I actually started writing, because I realized that what I usually want to get at is the kind of is what's the emotional core of the thing I'm doing. What's the emotional dynamic that's going to take me and the reader from one end to the other. And those things, that thing is nothing to do with research. That is to do with the imagination, and also what I call sort of imaginary facts. So I have this sort of theory about real facts and imaginary facts. And with me, the imaginary facts have to take precedence. And then as I write, I discover what real facts I need to know. So it's almost like writing in order to find out what I need to find out. I mean, there are problems with that, of course, because you end up writing scenes that couldn't possibly have happened. And there was a kind of nightmare moment quite late on. I think I write lots of drafts of a book, but this was about 7th draft, I think, and I had discovered the only biography of Claude Cahun, which was in French, and I'd struggled. My French is okay, but it's a struggle to read a French intellectual biography. And I struggled through it, and I gleaned stuff from it, and I realized I was going to have to see the man sooner or later, because I had so many questions. So I went to Normandy, and I spent 3 days with him. And on the first night we had dinner, and I started describing the opening of my novel, the opening chapter, which was 4 pages. I'd worked really hard on it. I was kind of proud of it. And as I was describing it to him at the dinner table, he began to kind of shake his head. By the end, he just said, "Non, impossible." So there was the end of my novel gone. And then for some reason, almost perversely, I started describing the end of my novel, and it was the same thing, So I went to bed that night having lost both the beginning and the end, or so I thought, imagining that the next 3 days I was going to lose the rest of it, Of course, it didn't work out quite like that, because what he was objecting to was the fact that what I'd invented was not recorded by anybody, because Claude Cahun wrote quite a lot. And she didn't record the scenes in the same way as I'd recorded it, but my version was, well, okay, no one says it didn't happen. Basically he's saying no one says it did happen. I'm saying no one says it didn't, and it's possible. So, we had this kind of it's the argument between the imagination and then the academic. you know, like that, the dry, dusty thing that Nadifah was talking about, and the person who comes in and tries to work out what the dreams, the fears, the thoughts, the psyche of the characters is like.
Yeah, I was wondering, I mean, the next question I was going to ask of all three of you has actually in a way been asked. I have a little private feed of what our audience members are asking. And I was going to, you know, wait another 10 minutes before throwing it over to our audience members and to those questions. But actually, one of the questions was exactly the one I want to ask next. So, so actually I will read it out because it puts it as well as I would have ever done, which is how much, this is for all of you, really, I think, how much did you consider feelings or possible reactions of real people or their relatives or friends who were involved in the events on which you based your work? Did it affect your writing in any way? And I would just throw into this, I mean, I think that is, to me, a really interesting question. But just before we get the answers, each one of these books has an acknowledgement section, and not all novels and not all collections of poems have acknowledgements, or if they do, they tend to thank the publisher and the agent and maybe the partner. But these are quite interesting and significant acknowledgements in all three of these books, which name some of the people that our authors have talked to and listened to whilst writing, and Rupert's just been telling us a bit about that. Yes, can I come to you first this time, Jay?
Yeah.
Because 1981 to me isn't so long ago, despite the sort of amnesia that, as you rightly say, that sort of clouded, that descended on those events. I mean, what would you say in answer to the question that our audience member asks?
Yeah, it was a really, really big question for me. I think you touched on some of the sensitivities around this when you asked Rupert about what it meant, you know, for him to enter the mind of a teenage lesbian in France, you know. And I had to ask myself the same question. Who am I to write this stuff? And what am I doing? And why? And, you know, is it better to let sleeping dogs lie? All of this stuff. But in the end, I think you also have to accept that some things eventually pass into history, and that private, personal, and family ownership, sometimes that can be a hindrance to people sort of doing what's needed with a text. So I spent maybe a year feeling really like weird about it. You know, I was also thinking, you know, who am I to sort of knock on these people's door and ask them to sort of regurgitate their trauma to me? I didn't think that was right either. And so because of that, I also decided not to go with a particularly journalistic approach, because, you know, as you say, Rupert, there's an imaginative space that is just as important and necessary. So I went down that route. But what I did do was I did get in touch with a few people who'd also written about this stuff or who'd been involved. And I kind of spoke to them. And one of them in particular said, don't knock on their doors, just do what you're doing. Because ultimately this is an act of the imagination. It's also an act of going into the archives. All of this stuff is publicly available. I'm not revealing anything personal. There's no personal information whatsoever. And maybe there's another version of Serge, or, you know, another writer will do that deep historical investigative work, but that wasn't my role. And so, of course, I acknowledged the family, and of course, I acknowledged all of the groups, because I also talk about Grenfell as well. But I also, in my actions, did not go down the path that I think would have necessitated more of an engagement or asking permission from those people.
I mean, Nadifah, I guess I'm asking you the same question, but also the one I was going to ask next, really, which is, you know, if you you presumably felt showed what you were writing to your father at some stage. Was there anybody apart from him whom you had to, as it were, think about and whose feelings you had to consult? You're muted. Sorry.
Not so much with Black Mamba Boy, and because he's there, I was able to check everything, and he would say, "I'll tell you this, but this is not for the book." And we could negotiate constantly. And I did show him the novel. I think he only read the novel after it was published, but it was something. Once it became a public thing rather than a private thing between me and him. I think his relationship with the project changed slightly, and it took time for him. He was happy with everything, but it just took time for him to be able to read it, and he read it very slowly. And he didn't read fiction. He was very much a nerd who read dictionaries and history books and all sorts of things like that. With my second novel, it was loosely based on some family experiences, but pretty much imagined. So that I felt awkward about writing.
That's The Orchard of Lost Souls, is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Which is set in Somalia during the dictatorship and the beginning of the Somali Civil War. So that was, I think, a book that made me question: is it my place to write this? Because I didn't live through this, while many of my family members did, and hundreds of thousands of other people. And actually, this question is most relevant to the book I've just finished, which is called The Fortune Men. And it's the first one that's not to do with my family in any way. And it's a historic miscarriage of justice against a Somali man that my father knew in Cardiff in 1952. And even though it's 70 years old, it's one I really struggled with in terms of feeling like I'm meddling. And I've done lots of first-hand research, interviews with people that were connected to the case, with family members of the victim, as well as the man who was wrongly executed. And the trauma is still there. It's evident 70 years on, whether it's within that same generation or 3 generations down the line. And I'm just about to send the book to the family members to have them feeling involved, and to thank them for their help and for the things they've told me. But it is an uncomfortable position to be in, because there's a power exchange at some point where you're given something. And with my father, I felt that as well. He gave me a gift of his story, and it was down to me to work with it ethically, to use it ethically. And I think I do, but that's also subjective. And in Black Mamba Boy, in the editing process, I killed off my father's mother. And that was very strange, and it took him some time to be happy with that, okay with that. And in the third novel, The Fortune Men, I'm putting words into people's mouths, and using their own words from the archives and from newspaper reports, but also putting my own words in their own mouth. And that feels funny.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, because the very first question that we had from an audience member today was, is it possible to write 100% true story that has no place for fiction at all? And I guess your, one answer might be your pedantic colonialist sort of record of, but there is
they're often fictional as well.
Of course.
They're completely fictional.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder, because if I could slightly turn that question, I don't know if this is what our audience member had in mind, but there has been a kind of novel recently, and I guess I've mentioned her name already, so I'll mention again, Hilary Mantel's historical novels, where, unlike historical novelists of the past, of course, she invents everything that's thought and said, but not a single fact, as it were, that is in the novels contradicts what is in the records, which is a bit different from saying they're all true. But she goes to the extent of not inventing named characters who didn't exist, all the servants are the real servants and so on. And she's notoriously sort of fastidious about it. Can I ask you, Rupert? I mean, Nadifa's given a really significant example of something she changed in the record. for the purposes of her novel. Did you feel, as it were, there were things that you couldn't change, that you had to leave as facts, even if they were facts which, you know, were inconvenient for the novelist?
Yeah, the downside of my approach to the whole project was really the fact that I researched as I went along, and I found out more and more as I went along, but the book was getting more and more finished. But I would often discover very inconvenient things, like you've got Marcel Moore telling the story. I suddenly found out at a very late stage that she'd had a mastectomy in her early 30s. It seemed kind of utterly unlikely that she would not mention this at all in the book I was writing, as it were, she was writing. So I had to include it. It's almost like once you know something, you can't not know it. You can't unknow it. And so I was very strict about, I didn't ever disobey history. You know, everything fits with history. But in a sense, that's not the part of the book that interests me anyway. What interests me is what's happening between the facts and behind the facts. You know, it's the bits behind closed doors that no one can possibly know about. So those are the bits. But that, of course, is also, to return to your earlier question, where the responsibility comes in as a writer. You know, like, because you feel like here are these two extraordinary people who really lived, and I'm taking it on, and I have to somehow do justice to it. And in a strange way, the more I began to discover about Marcel Moore's character, I mean, she's kind of very stubborn and solid, and like with an immensely wonderful streak of sarcastic, dry humor, which sort of brings the whole thing alive for me. And so using her character, I actually did have a scene in the book at one point where Claude Cahun, she imagines Claude Cahun leaning over her shoulder, even though she's dead, even though Claude Cahun is dead, and looking at what Marcel Moore is writing and saying, ugh, this is all so conventional, you know, this has all been done before, why are you even bothering? And so, you know, I had a scene like that, and then I took it out again because I thought actually Marcel Moore wouldn't have put that in. So, you know, but there is constantly this responsibility, but I had a kind of, a really interesting apprenticeship in that kind of responsibility, I guess, because I wrote a book in 2008 called Death of a Murderer about Myra Hindley and the Moors murderers, which people may not know about in Russia, but it was a young couple in Manchester who they killed 5 people, 4 of whom were children. And it was a massive case at the time. And the woman, the female partner, was far more demonized than the male, obviously, because it was a woman who'd killed children. And I was using this as a background for my novel. And there was a point at the end where I actually felt I had to write to the surviving mother of one of the missing children and say, are you okay with me doing this? I'm not sensationalizing it. I'm on the side of the children in many ways. But I felt like I did have to, I hate the verb reach out, but I felt I had to approach, you know, this one surviving parent and sort of get her permission in a way. And then 2 years later, I did a memoir, which you've already mentioned, This Party's Got to Stop. And everyone was alive in that practically. I was writing about my family. And it's no accident that most memoirs are about dead people, you know, children writing about their dead parents, because the parents can't answer back. But in my case, everyone was still alive and I had to get everyone's permission. So, you know, I sort of negotiated these very tricky waters already. And with this one, I was sort of ready for it. And I was asking myself the hardest questions from the beginning.
Right.
Can I just say
Nadifah,
something?
yeah.
I've just realized something. We all write about real lives, but we don't write what's understood as autofiction. And why is that? Why do we avoid it?
Why? Well, why? What do you think the answer is, Nadifah?
It feels too raw, and I think the immersion in someone else's life and the research and all of that is a big part of why I want to write in the first place. And I wouldn't have to research my own life, and I think I'd lose some of the pleasure of writing that way. And also I think something that makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable with some of the auto fiction I've read is that it's quite ruthless towards the people in the writer's life. And that to me makes me just a little bit.
Nadifa, did you ever consider, but did you ever consider a kind of almost like a memoir of your father's?
This is a really good question, Rupert, because it's one of the questions we're going to have to finish in a couple of minutes, but it's a really good place to end because it's actually one of the questions one of our members of our audience has asked. Did you ever think of writing this not as a fiction or if fiction, if we can expand that word to include your collection as well, but in some form, in your case, Nadifa, of an actual memoir? Did you ever think of that?
It started off as a biography, a straight biography. That's what I was intending, and keeping completely to the facts. And that's what my father was expecting as well. And I just couldn't do it. That was the reason I had to change, because my father was incredible about remembering everything apart from his inner life. He said he didn't have an inner life. He didn't care about anything. Just hunger, safety, very basic requirements, and he didn't think about anything else. And I just couldn't believe that. And maybe that's because I've lived too comfortable a life, and that's what you get into. That's the mind of someone who's under threat constantly. But I just couldn't believe it. And I think he must have craved his mother, his father, various people, you know, friends, things like that. And I had to step in because I couldn't imagine the life he was telling me.
It was also a halfway stage, though, between the biography and the novel, isn't there? Which is the kind of memoir where you, as the writer, are putting together a kind of mosaic of your father's life. You'd be selecting. You know, you wouldn't just be writing everything. You'd start putting together a different, your own concoction, if you like, of his life. So you jumped over that. You jumped over that straight to the novel.
I did, but without realizing, and it's because I didn't know what I was doing. It was the first thing I wrote, so I just.
It's really good not to know what you're doing sometimes, isn't it? I just wonder, Jay, we have to be quite briefly. Did you ever think of writing about the New Crossfire in a sort of different way from the way that you did?
Yeah, I still do. I actually think this is going to be probably one of the topics that I return to over and over again. But this way was also a product, I think, of, as you said, that was a really beautiful phrase you used, Rupert, which is, I think, an apprentice to research or something like this. Yeah, and I really felt that with Serge. I'm an apprentice to history.
Right. Well, that's a great copyright, Ruperт Tomson. That's a great.
We're all apprentices.
We're all apprentices to history, and with that resonant motto, I think we can end. And thank you all very much for attending in this strange and virtual world of attendance, and for all your questions. There were lots of questions. We did manage to cover a few of them, but not all of them. One of them said, John, you mentioned you're studying Tennyson's work. Could you tell us a little more? I'm not, actually. That was a fiction. I'm not studying Tennyson's work. So that's the easiest question of the evening to answer, of the morning for us, early afternoon to answer. But I'm sure you'd want me to thank very much Jay, Nadifa and Rupert. And I sometimes say I really enjoyed this event in a kind of conventional way, but actually I've really enjoyed it. And my only sadness is that I haven't actually met you, and especially I haven't been there to meet and to be with you in the audience in Russia. But thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed it too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, you. And lovely readings by you too, by the way. I forgot to say that at the beginning. Really loved hearing.
Yeah, it was lovely to hear you both.
And you, Rupert. Thank you, John.
Okay, a pleasure. You're muted, Misha.
Прошу прощения, да. Все, мы все постигаем, все науки Зума. Джон, Джей, Надифа, Руперт. Спасибо вам большое. Мы сейчас вам отправляем в чат почту, куда можно будет направить все свои вопросы. Там также присутствуют указания, поэтому если у вас вдруг остались какие-то вещи, которые бы вы хотели узнать от наших сегодняшних замечательных, интереснейших спикеров, пожалуйста, отправляйте нам их непременно туда. Джон, спасибо за такую интересную модерацию. Я как будто, и мы, я думаю, у всех такое ощущение, что мы в настоящем каком-то реалити-шоу, где собрались одни из самых интересных писателей молодого времени. Джей, Надифа, Руперт, спасибо вам тоже большое. Мы вам всем желаем хорошего начала рабочей недели. И давайте расскажем, что же нас с вами ждет дальше сегодня на фестивале Different Ever After. Сегодня, 25 октября, 17:00, что уже совсем скоро, мы поговорим с вами о легендарной стипендии, которая называется Chevening. На онлайн-встрече сотрудники посольства Великобритании в Москве проведут презентацию стипендий и ответят на самые популярные вопросы. Также, если это традиция, если традиции нет, давайте поаплодируем нашим сегодняшним спикерам, давайте поаплодируем нашим писателям. Эти аплодисменты хоть и невозможно слышать и видеть, но мы уверены, что они есть. На этом все. Увидимся с вами в 17:00 и поговорим о стипендии Chevening. Пожалуйста, на фестиваль Different Ever After.